Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We know that there are a lot of events going on, including today, a lot of things in the news too. Exciting to see the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a historic day. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside. Really excited to have our team present a report. It'll be in draft form on our website today. This is something we're doing more and more as we release reports, because what we find is in the course of the conversation that we have with our expert panelists, which you'll be hearing from today, as well as from the audience, that we incorporate that feedback before we push the final report out. And we anticipate releasing that either on Monday or Tuesday coming up. We have, in addition to people from our team, Gary Redberg and Beth Tamiose presenting our findings. We have an amazing panel. You're in for a treat today. We have Dina Walker from Blue Educational Foundation, Carlos Ayala from Growing Inland Achievement, Max Espinoza from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Ricardo Chavez from Riverside Community College, but serving an important role in the statewide student association. I'll turn it over to Gary, who will lead us through some of the main findings from our report.
Excellent, thank you, Karthik. Eric, you can go to the next slide there. And one more slide. So hi, everybody. My name is Gary Redberg, and I'm the research manager at the Center for Social Innovation. So we conducted a mixed methods report looking into the state of equity in higher education at the state level and different subregions in California. We also took a deep dive into the higher education advocacy infrastructure in the state to better understand how advocacy happens and the different roles and relationships that are involved there. So in terms of the big picture, California has invested a lot more in education recently. Last year, Governor Newsom signed a $47 billion higher education package. There's also been different pieces of legislation aiming to address things like college affordability. And while there have been increases in metrics like enrollment and completion, the gains are not equally spread across regions, and in particular for communities of color, particularly Black and Native American students. In terms of the advocacy infrastructure, we find that higher education advocacy tends to happen kind of from the top down, so the state level advocacy organizations. But there's also an important feedback that happens at both the local and regional level. So we'll be digging into that a little bit later as well. Next slide, Eric. So first, it's important to start at the beginning. The first colleges in California started coming up around the gold rush era. It's important to recognize that many of the early founders and leaders of some of these schools were openly racist and not welcoming to students of color and women. We talk a little bit about things like UC Berkeley and the recent building name change that they've done because of issues like this. So by about 1920, the three-part system that we know today was largely in place. So the UC, Cal State system, and California Community College system. And the original goal was for the system to be both physically and financially accessible for all Californians. So each of these systems are independent of one another, although they work together. Starting in the 1950s, leaders started getting together because they knew the baby boom generation was about to go to college. In addition, the GI Bill also increased enrollment. So they created the California Master Plan for Education. And I'm sure many of you on this call know what that is since you work in this field. So while there haven't been many changes, there's been some reviews and small things here and there. It's largely been untouched since 1960. And considering, the California system has grown to be the largest and most diverse in the nation, considering the changing workforce, pandemic impacts, and really making the goal of accessibility for all, there's still some more work to be done there. So next slide, please. So according to research by Campaign for College Opportunity, PPIC, and many others, a solid majority of California's prospective college-age population are going to be coming from underrepresented groups in higher education. This includes Latino, Black, and Native American students, low-income students, just to name a few. And these groups face significant barriers in terms of college readiness and completion. Importantly, the data show inequitable educational outcomes, and there are a lot of factors at play. But some important things to flag, and we talk a lot about different things in the report, are having a curriculum that's culturally appropriate, the lack of diversity and representation in leadership, faculty, and other factors like the impacts from the pandemic, which exacerbated a lot of existing inequities. Next slide, please. So aside from supporting direct services for students, higher education advocates have also been working on a number of legislative and policy campaigns in recent years. So here are a few that are happening right now and that came through very strongly in the interviews that we conducted for this report. So each one of these campaigns has a direct impact on equity in higher education. And we go into more detail in the report and talk about some of the policy specifics during our panel discussion as well. Next slide, Eric. So in order to better understand the kind of overall picture of equity here, we wanted to look at the student populations that enroll in higher educational institutions in the state, including transfers, time to completion rates. We mainly focused on public universities because they have publicly available data, of course, and that their missions are to serve and create accessibility for higher education in the state. Next slide, please. So we looked at enrollment data from all the UCs by race between 2016 and 2020 is the slide here. Over time, UC enrollment across all races is relatively constant, but it's important to note that the absolute numbers of both Black and Native American students still remains very low over this time period. Next slide, please. And we're going to have a data appendix that is going to have a ton more graphs and charts and things. So we're just kind of presenting a snapshot here today. One more slide there, Eric. Okay, thanks. So we also dug into enrollment in terms of where students are coming from in the state. So like I said, we have a lot of extra charts and graphs you'll be able to look through in the data appendix. So here, Southern California is sending the most Latino students to the UCs, with LA County sending the most. And we also have a bunch of different regions that we looked at within the state, and in the report we defined those regions, and we'll tell you, specifically why we were looking into some of them. But next slide, please. So when we look at CSU, first-time enrollment by race, since 2000, we see a significant increase in Latino student enrollment and a decrease in white enrollment. And we see that Black and Native American students really have not increased enrollment since 2000 in the state overall at CSU. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at enrollment at CSU, we see a significant increase in Latino student enrollment from the Southern California region. This is since 2000. So other regions of California have increased enrollment as well, and there's an interesting 2020 to 2021 dip that it's possible it is pandemic related. There's some data to back that up, but it's still not totally clear like what's happening there yet. So something that we'll have to dig deeper into. Now there is some population growth, but even taking that into account, this increase is very large. Next slide, please. So another important indicator are transfer rates. For the UCs, we can look back to 2016, and we see relatively constant transfer rates over time by all races. And again, if you think about it in terms of raw numbers, Black and Native American student transfers also remain very low. Next slide, please. So when looking at the CSU system, we can go back a little further to 2013. We see an increase in Latino transfer rates, that's the gray bar there, and a decrease in white transfer rates as well. And like the UC transfers, we see that Black and Native American student transfer rates are very low here as well. Next slide. So last of the graphs, we considered completion rates as time to completion, meaning the percentage of students that graduated from a four-year university, either at the fourth, fifth, or sixth year plus. In terms of the four-year rate, completion rates have increased over time for all systems and types since 2000. And for the sixth year, the UC system showed no change, whereas other public and CSU systems both saw a little bit of an increase. Next slide. Excellent, thanks. So this report also relies on in-depth interviews with higher education advocacy stakeholders that were conducted starting in 2021, and we finished earlier this year. We probably talked to some people that are on this call, I'm sure. The interviewees were throughout the state, and they represented a pretty diverse group of organizations in the education equity space. And we asked them how they viewed the relationships and roles of higher education advocacy organizations in the state and how they thought that that system functioned. And we also fielded a small survey that helped to inform the advocacy model that we're going to present as well. Next slide, please. So we aggregated the findings from the survey and interviews to create kind of broad themes or common themes. And there was a clear focus on building up capacity across all organization levels. Organizations are recognizing an increasing need for student services, and they need to build out their own capacity to meet those needs. The importance of information, data, and data sharing between partners and across sectors was another common theme. And we found that smaller local organizations often wrestled with their relationship with policy and legislative advocacy. They're often the ones engaging directly with students, providing services, and through those relationships, those smaller organizations are able to lift up student voices. But some are cautious when it comes to official lobbying for policies, which is understandable for sure. Next slide, please. Excellent. One more slide, Eric. So based on our interview and survey analysis, we created a model that details the relationship between these advocacy organizations in terms of policy advocacy, data sharing, partnerships, coalitions, networks. So it's important to say that this model reflects our data and it simplifies very complex relationships. So we don't claim for this to be a, this is the whole story, but we believe that's definitely part of the story. So the three blue boxes are different levels of higher education advocacy organizations. The state level organizations generally do statewide legislative advocacy. They help set the policy agenda. They also tend to have influence and the relationships that drive that influence in Sacramento. They produce statewide research and reports and often filter that information down through regional hub organizations, which then ultimately go to the community level organizations. So state level organizations will directly engage with community groups, but it doesn't seem to be a consistent line of communication, and very often it's mediated through these regional networks and hubs. Now, the regional organizations are really interesting because they often hold the very large regional networks, partnerships, and coalitions, and those can be mobilized to help support policy as it comes down the line. They often hold important regional data and produce regional reports. They have data dashboards and things like that that help smaller organizations utilize data for their purposes. They also help filter back out feedback on policy implementation and other issues that are happening at the local level, ideally to then advocate for refinement and changes to policy at the state level. So the local organizations are providing direct services to students. They help lift up student voice and leadership. They're working on the ground with less capacity to do state level policy work. But even though they may be less involved, state policy, once it's passed, will affect them just the same. So now there are other groups not depicted here for simplicity's sake, so government regulatory agencies, funders, school districts themselves, each one of those groups has a role in the advocacy and legislative process, and they interface with these advocacy organizations just at different levels. But we wanted to provide this just as a snapshot of how we're thinking about how this process works. Next slide, please. So some of the strengths of this model is that there's really great collaboration between the levels in general. I mean, it depends on the region. Some regions are stronger than others here. This also helps smaller organizations have input in the policy process. When we think about in terms of ways to make it better, I'm sure people on this call will have some great ideas of their own, but we suggest there could be more consistent engagement between the state level and regional and local level organizations. Also, more direct community engagement through things like listening sessions at all levels, really. And then finally, capacity building for all, especially those local and regional hubs that often have less resources. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to talk a little bit about some policy options. So you can go to the next slide, Eric. So taking this all into consideration, we've added some policy options that could help increase equity in higher education in the state. Things like increasing access and affordability are great, but we also need to make sure we're focusing on actual education outcomes, college completion, and ultimately a person being able to get a good job. We need to make higher education a more welcoming place for underrepresented students. This could be through decolonizing curriculum and increasing teacher diversity, taking steps like that. And strengthening pipelines that align with the future workforce needs is also very important. We're not quite sure what the future holds in terms of the future of work with automation, with impacts from the pandemic and recent changes. So we want to make sure that we're aligned with that. And also updating those master plan goals and ultimately more targeted investment for underrepresented students in the system. And you can go to the next slide. So I know that was a bunch. So we have a couple minutes for some questions, and then we're going to move into to talk with our panel. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type them in on the chat, or you can raise your hand. Okay. All right. So since we're moving on time, we'll go ahead and start our panel discussion. But if anyone does have any additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then we'll be sure to do that. So Eric, could you go ahead and share your screen once more? Excellent. So next, we're going to move to the panelist discussion on higher education equity, and we have a wonderful group of people today that are really involved in this kind of work. So before we get into specific questions, I'd just like to quickly call on each panelist, and if each of you could give us just a little bit of background about your work and how it relates to equity in higher education. It doesn't have to be specifically in the Inland Empire region. It could be kind of wherever you're doing work. But Dr. Ayala, I could call on you first to introduce yourself.
Not sure if he's able to unmute himself. You might also just want to stop the screen share.
I got it. Got it. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Carlos Ayala. I am the president and CEO of Growing Inland Achievement, and we work with a regional network that we call the Inland Empire Educational Network, and many of the folks on this call are part of that network. And we have a board, a governing board, and that governing board is comprised, the majority are the higher ed leaders in our space. They came together in 2015, and they wanted to break down barriers between the different levels of education, elementary, secondary, post-secondary, community college, and the 4 years, and find ways to better support students' progress in the Inland Empire and raise the educational rate of the Inland Empire at all levels. And during our strategic planning during the last year, based on what our board recommended, what our steering committee provided, and what our action network teams created, we have these collective impact teams that work together. Our focus and our goals are right smack in the middle and pointing towards equity issues. And so if you were to jump on our webpage and you would see some of our goals, you'll see they're about dismantling racist structures in our space. And we know, and the leadership in the region knows, that this is of primary importance in a region like the Inland Empire. And we have a lot of work to do. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to hearing more comments about the report. Thank you, Gary.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ayala. Next up, we have Dina Walker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dina Walker, President and CEO of Blue Educational Foundation. We're located in San Bernardino, and we serve San Bernardino and Riverside counties primarily. But we do also some work in LA County, and of course our partnerships and work statewide. What we actually do is primarily, we do direct service as a way to inform higher ed policies and practices. And so while we have college advisors and other staff that work in schools to support students and families to get to make sure that they have access to college and get information. We also work with the schools and as well as other advocacy organizations locally here in the Inland Empire as well as statewide on policy issues that affect the access and completion of students with a big focus on equity. So our primary goal is always every year taking a look at key data points and inform our work and where we're going to focus not only our direct service, but also where we focus our policy as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dina. And next up, I'll ask Max Espinoza to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Max Espinoza, and good to be with everybody. And I professionally serve as Senior Program Officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and my focus for the foundation is on our work in California. I've been with the foundation for just over 6 years, and previously worked in California for a number of years in the state capitol, and am a fellow Californian. My home town is San Diego, California, although I've been away for a long time, but really good to be with you all. Our focus is in supporting, institutions, advocacy organizations, intermediary organizations, in ensuring that students, particularly students of color and low-income students, have the opportunity to get a quality education and go on to get a higher education and be in a position to enter the workforce in a strong position. So good to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Last up, Gerardo.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ricardo Chavez. I'm a student at Riverside City College, and I also serve as the president for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges, or simply known as the SSCCC. The SSCCC is that representative body of the 2.1 million students that we have in our California community college system. We are the largest higher education system in the nation, with 116 community colleges. And the work that we're doing is to pursue policies that will increase student access, promote student success. We have different structures. We focus on regional support and development, so making sure that we are empowering our local student leaders to make change within their communities. Also, being an advocate through the legislative and budget process. We believe that that is how we can make everlasting change for our students. And the last one is through our participatory governance, working with our academic senate, working with the chancellor's office and the board of governors to make sure that regulatory rules within Title V is working for our students.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gerardo. So our first question, and I just put it to the chat here. We want to talk about, we flag a lot of different important policy in the report, and there's so much looking throughout history. I mean, I had to do a lot of history kind of research for this report, and there's so much in terms of policies that affect equity and education in California. But we want to talk about what are some of the recent important policy wins that promote equity in higher education. And it could be, part of the implementation of AB 705. We see that's being implemented in different ways across the state, or other kind of notable policies. So this is a question posed to the group. So any of the panelists can chime in.
I can definitely start with the student perspective. We were very excited to see Assembly members bill AB 705, which aimed to provide basic needs coordinators for our California community colleges. We know that basic needs is one of the most prominent issues that our students are facing, even before the pandemic. And to allow for one specific individual to be on campus, to be able to know what are the basic needs resources are available within that community is great. To have that person specialize on knowing where we can direct our students to get food at a food pantry, mental health resources, whatever it may be, is really allowing for resources to be available for our students. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is student success. So if we are eliminating those barriers, if we're allowing for resources to be an impediment for our students to succeed, then there's a problem. But with basic needs coordinators, we believe that that is a way that we are increasing equity by streamlining resources for our students. Also, we see that student housing is one of the most prominent issues that our students are facing, and we were very glad to see a $2 billion investment in affordable student housing. 50% of that investment is going to our California community colleges, especially for those students who are not able to find affordable housing on their own. Our demographics within California community colleges is shifting. We no longer just have 18, 19-year-olds. We have student parents, full-time, part-time workers. And with the inflation that we have right now in our current financial aid system, is really hard to be able to address a lot of the needs like rent. And if our community colleges are able to provide those affordable housing, that is how we are increasing equity within higher education.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks, Gerardo. Anyone else want to jump in on some important policy wins that you'd want to talk about?
Well, I'd just like to say on, Gerardo talked about AB 705, when it first was implemented around the access actually to coursework, so that folks, meaning students, whatever age they are not relegated to taking 7 classes before they can get to the college level transferable course. And so AB 705 has done a tremendous impact on the equity for students across the board, through all ethnicities and gender as well, and class. And so that has been one of the biggest pieces, for our region, especially around equity access for in the community college system, because the majority of our students will access post-secondary education through the community college, not the 4-year system. We've got some drawbacks, and I don't know if we're going to talk about the drawbacks, though, but that has been one of the greatest policy wins across the state for equity access. in our eyes.
Yeah, Dina, I think we definitely want to talk about the drawbacks for sure. I mean, I saw a couple studies that said that, there have been really good gains, but they've been kind of unevenly distributed. So maybe, we could talk a little bit about what are some of those problems, issues maybe with implementation.
I just have a couple of comments before we dive into that piece. One of the things that really stood out to me, I've been in the California education space for, I think, 35 years now. I'm getting up there, Gary. But this was a time, this AB 705 2017 was a policy act that really focused on changing curriculum and stepping into a space that had been sacred to the faculty in the community colleges and the four-year universities, and that really stood out to me as something that really was very powerful and a very powerful tool to precipitate change. And I agree with Dina around there's challenges associated with it. We in the Inland Empire, we're a regional organization, and we work with our 12 community colleges. The way in which different campuses are implementing AB 705 varies, and there are people trying to find back channels to how to kind of work around it, and these are things that we are going to just need to consistently push on to be able to create greater change for our students and to create a more student success completion oriented college, right? That we're just gonna have to continue to push on these, but the mechanism is something I think we need to be able to call out.
Gary, do you mind if I build on that, what Carlos just said? I want to say two things. One is that just my observation from my time in the legislature as a policy staff, but also doing national work and last 6 years returning to do California focused work again. I think what we've seen, which I think is really important for California, is this shift to really trying to look at evidence-based and data-driven policies. And so like in the policy creation, what do we know works? Where do we have data that shows us we need to focus and pay more attention to? And it's an ongoing work in progress, right? Because the data continues to be a thing that needs to be strengthened across systems for the state, et cetera. But if you look at a lot of these policy changes, they have focused on evidence-based, right? And data-driven policies and equity, right? Trying to find ways to address these things. So whether it's, developmental education reform, which we saw as the panelists have talked about, and AB 705 legislation, but also even in state actions to incentivize innovative programs that are evidence-based around developmental education reform, which came before the law itself, right? To try to encourage innovation and change, the CSU change, placement change, changing how students are placed into classes because we have better data now and understanding of, an assessment test is not the right way to necessarily place students. Like we need to look at GPA and multiple factors, right? Multiple indicators. The data says that's a better way. The evidence says that's a better way to place students than assuming they're not going to do well just because they didn't do well on a test, right? So I think there's a lot there. If we look at a thread throughout, the last 10 years, where California has just really begun to shift and in some ways lead the way. The last point I want to make, which really gets back to what Carlos is saying, is that the policy change is not enough, and this is where, folks, I think on the ground and in institutions and intermediaries and others play such a critical role, and advocates too, because, we can work really hard to get a policy change, but if the policy implementation isn't going well, or we're not vigilant, or folks aren't vigilant about oversight and even also supports, right? Because these are big changes. Some of these are really big changes for institutions. So what can we do collectively to support institutions in these very transformational changes that they're going to have to make, right? So that the spirit of the law and the law itself can actually be fulfilled, whatever it might be, in the funding initiatives, et cetera, right?
Thank you, Max. So before we move off of AB 705, Dina, did you want to say a little bit more there?
No, I think Carlos touched on it, is that the implementation is not consistent. And we find implementation and support for AB 705, even in the same community college district, very different from campus to campus. And so again, that still plays out to inequitable outcomes. And so those are the pieces, and Max touched on it as well, about what does that accountability look like, and accountability not only from the institution, but also some of the advocacy groups to work with them to be accountable for those outcomes.
Yeah, excellent. So actually kind of piggybacking a little bit off what Max had said, the next question we wanted to talk about is kind of the role of data. And, we're hearing about data a lot, now with AB 99, SB 2, and now with the Cradle to Career database that is, I believe it is going to be implemented. I think it's funded, but is not implemented yet. So I'm just curious about if any of you had, what was your experience with California and this journey to being able, for them to decide, hey, we need this Cradle to Career database, this is important for our work, and how a database like that with good data would impact the work that you are all doing in your different spaces.
I can start again. First of all, the role that data plays into advocacy is very crucial. I mean, we see the advocacy within AB 705, and we see that as we are streamlining accessibility to transfer level courses, we see an evident increase in success from our students. Meaning, students are more likely to succeed if they're enrolled in transfer level courses. If you add other factors like core requisite courses, academic support, rather than automatically enrolling students into remedial courses. But with the Cradle to Career database, never before have we seen an actual roadmap of the student experience, from the moment that they enter K through 12 to the moment that they graduate with their bachelor's degree. And I think this is very important that we're able to fully analyze every stage of education, so we are able to identify the areas that we need to be able to reinforce equity and streamline accessibility. As a student advocate, it's really hard to trace where did that inequity come from. You are a 30-year-old coming from the workforce, you're coming into community college. Where in our journey through the master plan, where did we identify that inequity, and what can we do? So this Cradle to Career database, we're able to have a full picture of what are students going through and what can we do.
Yeah, for us, it is, I mean, it's great. It is so hard, especially if you're not in an institution, to actually get data, right? Especially longitudinal. And how do you track, other than, a student giving you their information, how do you track this long term? And we know, especially when you're working with, marginalized communities and people first gens and people who are just transient, right? Meaning, and I'm saying transient as even myself, we've moved in the history of my daughter's educational career, we moved 4 times. So 2 different school districts, and we moved 4 different times. And so just to understand that, you can't always rely on whatever information you have to track where your students are. This is so very powerful. When Blue began doing our work years ago we started doing the College Exodus Project and trying to figure out how do we get base information so that we can, plot a plan of action. At that time in California, they were just getting ready to sunset this website. It was the website for post-secondary ed or something. You still can find out what schools are sending kids to college, what college, you still could find that, but they were sunsetting it at that point. And so I remember being able to still access that information. And once they closed it and said, hey, website's gone, it's a done deal, there was no way to kind of get like what's happening locally with our schools, with our community in our public universities. And so this, new system, being able to say that we can track now from the time you enter our public systems, you've got that number and we can get you through CalPEDS or whatever, this is phenomenal. And so the partnerships, not only with education, with K-12 and higher ed institutions, but even, from a community-based standpoint, having these data sharing agreements with these institutions so that we can be able to be partner and get the information so that we can track students even beyond what traditional institutions can do, because we're on the ground and we're actually meeting with families and individual students, and to be able to do that. But it is so powerful. A few years ago, well, several years ago now, when EdTrust West, really got on this thing, like we need this statewide system. And I remember, I think Ryan Smith was the CEO of EdTrust at that time. And I remember us going to the Capitol and our whole team, and we were like, and the buttons they were giving out was data is sexy. And, for most of us, we were like, no, data, no. Nobody ever associates data with being sexy. It's always like they're nerds and it's square and it's, but data is sexy. And really, when we start talking about this longitudinal system, I was bought in. I drank the Kool-Aid. I'm like, data is sexy. We need it. We've got to find it. And so it has really driven a lot of the work that not only we do as our organization from Blue, but our connection into GIA. So really, and them being really a local hub here in the region for data, right? Being able to also to reference and tell other organizations that we work with, like, if you need something, this is where you go get it, right? Like, this is how you get that snapshot. It's not just, this is what I think, or this is what I see from my vantage point of my counseling office that is only 6 foot by 6 foot, right? It's like, go and find this data, because this is going to help to inform and also create some great opportunities. And that is what this data piece has done, not only for us, but our partnerships around the region as well.
Yeah.
That the data piece is key. And when I speak to colleagues from across the nation, and I'm describing how we are in the nascent stage of an integrated data system, they kind of go, "What? California? What?" And it's just something that we've been asking for a real long time. And key features that we need to make sure that are embedded in there. And I know that the work is being led by an outstanding group of people, is to be able to track interventions that occur really early in a child's educational career and how that plays out further forward. There's some work that our colleagues at the Riverside County Office of Education, and in particular the Riverside County Educational Collaborative, where they've really rallied a lot of the school districts in Riverside to participate in the National Student Clearinghouse. And that's a national data system that districts put information in there, and you can actually track students from high school into their college going spaces. And they're able to make some really important discoveries about what's working and what's not working that can then inform other districts and other organizations. And I'm really proud to state that now throughout the whole region, all 2 counties, districts have signed up for the National Student Clearinghouse, and we're waiting for that information to go in. So I'm really looking forward to this the California data system that would allow us to look at that, because I have organizations coming to me that are working with 4th graders. They're bringing in a college kid from one of the post-secondary systems, and they have these ambassador programs where they're shepherding these students who are not the traditional college-going students, and they need to understand how they can be effective. And right now, they patch together their data. This is going to provide us with something very effective, and I believe that we really need to make this data transparent and public so that people can have access to it. So we can ask the question, hey, school district, hey, college, hey, university, what's this? So that we, because we're all moving towards the same direction, this idea of using education to support human life and promote the economic viability of our state, that we need to be able to hold each other accountable, and this data system is going to be able to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carlos. So one thing I was curious about, it's difficult to get data. We're doing a report coming up with first fives, and we're looking at like the 0 through 5 age range. It's very difficult to get data that early and different things like that. So I was just curious, beyond kind of like the typical indicators that you see, some of the ones that are available now, and thinking about how so many different factors affect education, like housing and food insecurity. What additional indicators would be helpful for the work that you all do that you would really like to have? And maybe not necessarily in the Cradle to Career database, but more in general, what would you like to be able to dig into deeper?
Well, I think a lot about this. The way that the GIA we think about it, and again, when I talk about GIA, I'm talking about the network. So it's our steering committee, our action network teams. We've actually come to an agreement on leading indicators and lagging indicators, and being able to track some of those is very, very tedious. And you talked about the early childhood space. There's no agreement. There's no agreement on what is the right tool to measure, kindergarten readiness or preparation for kindergarten. You go to different organizations, they're going to have different metrics, and they have their reasons for it, whatever. And so, just going through a process of coming to an agreement on what those indicators are is probably the most important thing. And I think that it's in the space around bringing people together and having those conversations where a lot of the learning happens. And so I can't point to one specific thing, but it's this idea of bringing people together and saying, well, what's important to us? How do we track that? What tools are available to track that? And then making a decision about that, whether it happens with that at the local level or regional level or the state level. The state can provide us guidance like they do with the K-12, right? They have those little dashboard, the little, whether the district is green, yellow, or red in terms of meeting some indicator. Those kind of things are public, are successful. They change districts, but I think at each organization, each level needs to have this conversation.
Yeah, and even in the conversations that we've had throughout the state, especially with the like regional organizations, kind of like GIA or North State Together, that have a lot of regional data, like the Data Dashboard Hub and all those kind of things. There are a lot of these data sharing agreements and just kind of like these organic partnerships that came together to kind of fill that space. So it'll be interesting to see, if the Cradle to Career database system does get off the ground and it's a really, really great system, see how that dynamic changes,
Yeah. Well, one last point, Gary. So my previous life, I was the dean of the School of Education at Sonoma State University. I worked a lot with the K-12 school districts in the region. And one of the things that we did working with the school districts was actually work with them to collect information and data about interventions that aren't always captured in state systems or in district systems. Because what you have is a group of third grade teachers trying some new curriculum, trying some new ways of doing things. And there's not always ways to flag those students in those data systems. And so what a lot of times we ended up having to do was download all this data from the school district, put it in an Excel file, download the stuff from the state, and then find ways to merge it around the student ID or whatever number that we could. And so being able to have mechanisms that in a very equity, justice oriented way be able to flag interventions so that we can track those interventions in a more productive and a collective way are really important. I worry, and I use the word justice oriented way because you could use it for something else, for tracking, and I would really want to be cautious about that. But when I speak to teachers or administrators, they're wondering those questions. That's a question that they're wondering about.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Before we change the conversation slightly here, anyone else want to speak on any data related anything there?
I was just going to add, I really love what Carlos said about data being and talking about the data as an opportunity to learn, right? And I also think that it's going to take multiple data sources for a lot of these things to be addressed. Like the state data system is really important because that's a big gap and a missing thing that California is one of the few states that didn't have one, and thankfully that's going to be rectified soon as the thing gets built. But there will continue to be a need and a reliance for local, more granular data projects and systems like what Carlos and his team are doing, with the clearinghouse and in partnership with institutions to really get at what's happening locally and regionally and even at a micro level. So it's sort of a combination of these things. The problem right now is California has all these gaps, right? And so all these efforts are really trying to rectify those gaps. So I think collectively, we need to continue to fight for state data that's strong and shows the interconnections, where the gaps are, the transition from early ed, K-12, post-secondary workforce, et cetera. And then locally, like really drilling down on what's happening locally between institutions, with students, equity, et cetera.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And that's actually something that kind of came up in some of the interviews that we did. Because a lot of the state level advocacy organizations, they do state level reports, and sometimes they'll drill into specific regions as well. But they largely kind of rely on more local regional institutions to provide the story about what's happening there. And they go to them as the regional kind of expert. So it's kind of filling that void, like you're able to, the better data that these smaller, well, not smaller, but regional and local organizations have, the more they'll be able to kind of tell their story and say like, okay, this is what's happening here. Because just looking at the data by itself, it doesn't give you the full picture. We all know that you have to go in and talk to people and see what's happening on the ground, because data can be misleading sometimes, so that's a really important piece. So kind of moving into that a little bit, we wanted to talk about what are the dominant narratives, or, like what's the story about higher education in the region? And do some of those narratives need to change? And how should we be talking about equity in higher education in our region? And I think, Gerardo, maybe you could provide a little bit about like the student perspective, what's kind of happening on the ground in terms of like student activism and what you all are doing. And Dina, I know you've got a lot of community work that you're involved in. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I was very fortunate to be able to do some in-person visits to our campuses. We haven't visited all campuses because we have 116 colleges in our system, and but we were able to visit 25 plus campuses so far, and we were able to talk to students and really hear from them. What is going on? We're still in the pandemic. You're here in college. You haven't, like many of our students are facing, have quit and decided to go back to the workforce. But the number one narrative that we're hearing from our students is the lack of resources. And the lack of resources could either vary. Our categorical programs are not adjusted to the cost of living of today. So many of our categorical programs like EOPS, CalWorks are not receiving enough funding to be able to address the needs of today. And we are seeing a much more increase of need, and our programs are not able to address that. Also, our financial aid system is not adjusted to today's need. That is why we need to be able to reform our Cal Grant and our financial aid to be able to be responsive to the growing need of the pandemic. And that is what we're calling for our legislators to be able to be on board with passing this through the legislation, even the governor, calling for the governor to respond to what students are being calling for Cal Grant reform. And those are just some of the stories that we are hearing. I mean, our system is so diverse. We hear from our non-traditional students, which I cherish. I aim to listen to our non-traditional students because our system has focused too much on our 18, 19-year-olds, which is great. But we need to be able to fully focus on the ever-growing population and diversity within our California community college system. But we hear from our students, our student parents, we don't have enough childcare on our campus. And I even visited Los Angeles Valley College, and I spoke to 2 student parents, and they told me my class starts at 3, childcare closes at 4, and my class ends at 5. What do you do there? And those are the what I call artificial barriers, because we can easily fix those. Artificial barriers that we need to tear down in order for our students to be successful. That is why I commend AB 775, the basic needs coordinators, because our students are not able to succeed if they're hungry. They're not able to succeed if they don't have technology, if they don't have internet, if they don't have a roof over their heads. So those are just some of the narratives that we're hearing from our students throughout our system.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Gerardo.
And I don't generally like to go negative. Glass half full, but one of the narratives I think that is, here is that college isn't for everybody. And so when people say that, to students, when they say that to parents, when they say that, and, in rooms, even of professionals, that college isn't for everyone, that all automatically says that somebody is not going to college. And that there are not going to be any resources or support for a chosen, whether chosen intentionally or unintentionally, population of people. And so with that said, because of that narrative, we have not built an adequate structure for the number of people that we have here who could have access to higher education and be successful because of that. And so that prevailing narrative has really hindered us, long term. And because of the migration now from other, southern counties and areas in California, it's going to even hit us even harder in these next 5 to 10 years. So changing that narrative and talking about that, but that's one of the prevailing narratives. The other narrative that we hear all the time and we see is that, this is something that's unspoken, is that college is only for certain types of students, and it's really high performing students. So people don't say it, but our systems and things that we have in place, even supports and programs, are for a select type of student. And generally it's nobody gets access to these things unless they have at least a 3.0 GPA, right? They don't get recommended for programs if they've had any more than 2 absences in the entire school year. It's like all of these things, right? Or your older brother or sister, quote unquote, was a troublemaker, right? We don't even, that last name, oh my God, we're not even gonna bring you into, into a room to hear about an opportunity. And or you already have to be in one of the, pre-selected, gifted programs from 2nd grade, right? Like, so just to really understand that this is not something that's written down, but we see it in the programs that we design and put in systems, and that we support habitually. And so thinking about what does that really mean? Because it means that, that these students have access to not only, the access to programs, but they have access to the human resources, meaning people and peers to support them. They have access to also to resources, whether it be enrichment programming, but then they also have access to the financial resources. So we're looking at what are the scholarship programs, what are the programs, even gifting programs, and what does that mean? Because again, it's all in, based on merit. And if we've looked at, in the Inland Empire around what does the grading look like, and how hard it is to find, and I'm speaking about this generally, yes, for everyone, but then, and when we're talking about equity, when we're looking at what those grading reports look like, we look and we can see what the grade span looks like and who's getting these types of grades, right? Generally, it's people who are not Black, brown, or Native. It's also not young men. Right. And so while we're not looking at that, and when we're disaggregating that, we are creating this whole culture, this whole narrative that is unspoken and unwritten, but is definitely practiced. And I would just say that, part of our work, even with GIA as part of this on our financial aid action team, is really looking at even how are we looking at giving out financial resources, not even just from the institutions, but even in communities. We've made this meritocracy even in our own communities. Right. One of the things that, I try to, when I'm working with other scholarship programs and things, I said, first of all, let's stop. Did you have a 3.5 when you were in high school? You know what I'm saying? Like, was that you? And if that wasn't you, then why would you put that type of barrier on your program for all these other students? Right? You just think about that, And so I think that those are the narratives that keep us from being really able to actualize our full potential here in the Inland Empire. Just those, again, the kind of the things that are said, college isn't for everybody. And we're like, wait a minute. And then these other unwritten, unspoken things that happen because we've built systems to create this inequity.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Dina. And it's like, goes back to part of it, like, we operating in the same box that we've always operated in, and doing anything new or innovative, like, it's outside the box. So oftentimes it's scary, or you don't get support because you're like, oh, that's a new thing, So excellent point. Any other response to Gerardo or what Dina mentioned, Max or Carlos, before we move on a little bit?
Just something that it triggers for me, it's just this, we're talking about narrative, right, of the region. And one of the things that I've thought about is just how we think sometimes of these places with a deficit mindset, the thing that we want to work against. And I feel like Dina and Gerardo both touched on it in different ways. And I feel like from what we know, and I mean, just the facts, right? Like, the Inland Empire region actually has a numerous assets. So, thinking about the region from an asset-based perspective, and the number one asset the region has, in my opinion, is the people in the region, exemplified by this panel, who are representative of many others in the region, and the diversity of the region, right? And so, the state has a lot to gain as a whole by the region being lifted up, and the region being highlighted and invested in, et cetera, which gets at the state regional connection too, right? Like, and so, yes, there is a need to prioritize the Inland Empire. But it's because there are a number of assets in the region that we should all be benefiting from as a state.
I just have one additional thing. Thank you so much, Gerardo, Dina, and Max. I think a really important thing to talk about is the mechanism for collecting the narrative, right? That, that's something that through our action network teams, of which Dina provides exceptional leadership in, and many others on this call, actually, the call to elevate the student voice and find mechanisms to listen to what the students are experiencing in a daily way goes beyond the data, right? It's that qualitative piece you were talking about, Gary. We need to have robust systems to be able to capture that student narrative on a regular basis. When working with our Action Network teams, we heard from a group of students how they wanted to form collaborative, or they wanted to have more leadership. And so what we're able to do in the region is working with organizations like Blue, create these leadership opportunities, and our community-based organizations can elevate the student voice, elevate leaders, so future leaders, so that they can come back and be on this panel in 10 years, or like Gerardo, be on there next week, right? And so we need to think about what are the mechanisms for listening, what are the mechanisms for taking action around those particular narratives. And I think that that's an area that we have seen some great progress, but it's an area that we need to codify and institutionalize in a more powerful way. And I don't know what policy that would be, but there's smarter people than me who could think about that. But I know that's the need.
Yeah, I think it's actually come up a little bit, Carlos, and just like us researching what organizations, what services organizations have been providing just more recently. And a lot of it is that student leadership pipeline stuff. I mean, like the Black Educator Pipeline, like Dina and the College Exodus Project, like those kind of things. It seems to be more common in these kind of like regional hub organizations. So I think that's a really good thing. And of course, this is just like my experience from who I've talked to. So I don't know if it's truly happening more, but it seems like there's a push towards that. So, people are graduating, great, now what? So, and a lot of them want to work in the communities that they're from. So that leadership training is super important. So I'm curious if you all had seen, I don't know if you're kind of expanding the services and work that you are all doing to include more of that, or so I don't know if it's a real trend, but it seems like more organizations are doing that, investing more in student voice leadership, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, GIA as working with the network, there are lots of instances of this happening. You just mentioned a few, right? And this idea of elevating the student voice and finding mechanisms to be able to do that, and then being able to take action based on what you have is an area that we're investing a lot of our energy in. And I know our colleagues both at San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools office and RCOE are really active in this space too. Yeah. Is to be able to capture that student voice and then feed it back. We have a small pilot project that we're working on, where we've had a local researcher do some qualitative asynchronous focus groups via chat model with college students and high school students. The questions came from our Action Network teams to that group. And we were able to identify some specific practices, like the one that Gerardo mentioned, like, childcare ends at 3, but my class goes till 5, right? That if you can take that information and show it to the leadership on the campuses, oftentimes they can find ways to make adjustments to those things. So that's why I'm calling for this, this effort around finding more of these kind of mechanisms to do it, because it's very clunky right now.
And I just want to add on to that, and thank you very much, Carlos, for bringing up the topic of amplifying the student voice, which is very important for us as student leaders to be able to be recognized as experts of our own experience. And I think we need to be able to fully digest that concept that students are able to be contributors to the solution, and being able to capture their experience to be able to be the remedy to many of the inequities that we're seeing in our system, But going beyond that to partnering with students, working with students from that community, allowing them to be able to spearhead many of those initiatives within the Student Senate. We believe that if we are able to allow students to be the North Star of our policy, then that's equity. Equity is to be allowing students to be able to be partners of the solution.
Excellent, thank you. And so we're going to have, I just have one more question here, and then we'll move into a time where the audience can ask us some questions. I saw a couple hands raised, so we'll get to that in just a moment. So our last question I wanted to pose is about action. So we've said all this, we've talked about all these things, and what are some strategic actions that we could take right now that would move us towards more equity in higher education? And the floor is open. It's a very broad question, but.
Well, I guess I'll start just to say there are two things in particular. And so there has to be deliberate plans with institutional accountability. We can talk, and we have been talking for years, and more deliberately around the last 2 years around equity, right? But if there are no deliberate plans around equity, meaning not just, a proclamation or a resolution, but they're actually, what is a systemic strategic plan around how you're going to achieve equity in more than just, let's say, student admissions, because we know that equity shouldn't stop there, right? Because students interact with so many other parts of institutions that there has to be equity in a 360-degree lens. But that has to happen. There has to be a deliberate plan with accountability. Like somebody's head should roll, right? Or multiple heads should roll. So that always keeps me on my job, right? So just thinking about that piece. And the other thing is that there has to be some intentional partnerships in and outside of the institutions, outside of K-12 and outside of higher ed. Because this is it's a large problem, right? So, you have to tackle it with a collective impact strategy. And that means that there are multiple players, there are multiple strategies, and then ideally, we're going to have some creativity and innovation to get to that. I think that one of the pieces around, just in looking at and reading the portions of the report that are available now, thinking about this notion about higher education access and success, that California has to understand that if we're going to get to that we cannot just be focused on the UC system. We cannot just be focused on California State University system. That there are multiple ways and many ways that people can get education, and it can be in private institutions in California. It can be out-of-state institutions. It can be historically Black colleges. Whatever that means, that we have to make sure that if we're intentional and we want our folks to have a quality higher education journey, that we're going to have to use other means to make sure that happens. And that does mean these outside partnerships. This does mean that we can say, we can educate you into this one piece and you go somewhere else, but ideally bring something, put them, make this a partnership in which people come back as well, right? So they don't just go to Missouri and get their degree and stay in Missouri. They're coming back to our region, coming back to our area, because we have an anchor already here. And that means, whatever that means, it could be that we're supporting them with scholarship dollars, but for us, it really means that we're keeping the connection with our students via not only scholarship dollars, but relationships, via internships, saying that we're going to educate you somewhere else because we've got a place for you here in our region. And so those are deliberate partnerships. This is where I think that, our guided pathways work, our, some of the work that we're launching, as well as in our pathways from our foundation, which is our purposeful pathways, and our one particular new pathway that we're launching in partnership with San Bernardino Valley College is our social justice and philanthropy pathway. So many young people want to work in community, right? They do want to work in their communities and do the work that got them there, right? So I know, Gerardo, if you're going to be a great person to work in a community-based agency or a nonprofit or in some kind of social justice, work, right? But we've got to teach and tell them those, and we've got to have places for people to land, right? And to be mentored. And that's the big piece of why when we're talking about when I'm talking about the partnerships in and outside of the institutions, those partnerships with community, with business, so that when we can, expand how folks get their higher education degrees, but they come back and they're here and they're still connected and anchored in our region. But those are, big concepts. And I know folks be like, oh, don't talk about anything outside of California. I understand and I get it, but we will not get to this equity issue and this opportunity and make sure that it is, accessible for all types of students unless we're really thinking about what is the expansive landscape of higher education opportunity. And that does mean that we need to be looking outside of 2 institutions here in California.
Thank you, Dina.
Just wanted to add, I really, those are such rich comments. The one kind of high level comment I would make from what I've observed is that one of the key pieces of everything you all have said to me seems the need for some coordination at the local level of like, what are our collective priorities, right, as a region? And I know through the work of GIA and Dina, your work with the Blue Foundation and others, you've been trying to do that. And the Inland Empire Community Foundation, which we also partner with, has been trying to do that particularly in the last several years through a new effort to really strengthen the region's collective voice on the governmental relations side, right? Like, what are the priorities of the region, and supporting policy tables, to really dig in on some of these issues with community members and other organizations like GIA and others, so that the region can have a collective voice in some way. We've seen that is successful for other regions, right? And so it takes a lot of work. As you all know, I don't need to tell you, you're doing it. But that part I think is really, from where I sit, it's starting to emerge. I can see it from afar, right? That the region is really trying to coalesce and channel its voice. And the region has like really influential, policymakers now that are at all levels now. So I think that's also really significant. Like, how do you leverage that? And it's not just Los Angeles and the Bay Area anymore, right? Potentially, it's regions like the Inland Empire that, if you're able to organize effectively with each other, you could have a lot of voice and influence over the outcomes, as you have. There's examples of it already where that's happened, but I think that piece, even though it's a kind of a meta statement, we should not lose it, because we could miss an opportunity, right?
Excellent. Thanks, Max. Gerardo or Carlos, any comments on future strategic action?
Sure. From my experience within student advocacy, something that I realized that we really can't get anywhere unless we have true commitment from local state leaders and federal leaders. If we get their commitment to student equity and success, and whenever there are bills, policies that are being formed that will be aimed to streamline accessibility and equity for our students, we need their commitment. We need commitment from the governor to be able to fully implement Cal Grant reform in order for our financial aid to be able to be fully responsive to today. Also, having a true comprehension of what are the needs of our students. I think that's the very foundation on what we stand on, so that way we're able to take appropriate action, because the needs of our students for today are going to be different from next year and the year after that. I definitely knew. I started my journey as a student leader right before the pandemic started in 2019, and then in the month our priorities shifted, and we need to be able to be resilient and adapt to the needs of our students.
Thank you. Oh, Carlos, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The only thing I would just double down on what so many of the other panelists have said is just the idea that, you know, we have to learn to work together, arm in arm in this work. And it's really hard to do because we're so used to try to go it alone and, you know, put the badge on us because we did good, we got the gold star, right? And that doesn't work. That hasn't worked. So having opportunities where the Center for Social Innovation, GIA, Blue, the Gates Foundation, student organizations working together, helping set priorities, making decisions about how we move forward, that's the model that's going to be successful. And what's really exciting is that here in the IE, it's starting to happen. You can feel the momentum build, and it's you know, you can feel it. And it's just so glad, I'm so proud of us and all the work that the network is doing. And many people on this call, the other folks listening, are participating in this. So kudos to all of you.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again. Really appreciate this wonderful collection of panelists here. And all the work that you're doing. So right now, we'll just take a couple minutes here at the end to have any audience questions for the panelists. I know I saw a couple hands raised. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please put up your hand and we can unmute you. Is it Alejandra?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find the little feature. So just really quickly, I had two questions. And so I know that we've been talking about focusing on how we can ensure that our students have a voice and that they feel represented within our communities. But how do we work to prepare and equip our teachers, our staff, our policy leaders, even our political figures to support our learners as well? So I know here at RCOE, we have an equity and inclusive practices initiative. And so we've been doing our best to ensure that students do have a voice and that individuals from different backgrounds and cultures are represented. But you know, it's always difficult when we talk about policy leaders or when we talk about political figures, because we always try to invite them to collaboration meetings and all of that, but I know they're so busy. And so what recommendations do you guys have to get them involved, to make this a priority for them as well? And then number two, it stems off a little bit on what Dina Walker was talking about in regards to partnerships. So I think it's important that we focus on how our families that come from different races and ethnicities or cultures perceive our school climate. And so what are your recommendations in regards to doing that? I know a lot of school districts have recently implemented new positions in regards to family engagement specialists or liaisons, but you know, we're trying to work with them on making sure that they address the needs of our families. And so any recommendations on that would be appreciated.
Well, I'll just address your second part of the question on how do you engage and get that voice. I mean, you touched on it already. Many districts are already starting to do these equity departments. They're hiring family engagement folks. They're bringing students onto their boards now to have input, and they're actually doubling down on some of the associated student body, entities and things of that sort. I think one of the biggest pieces though still is around this big plan, right? Because we're all still talking in our own silos in districts and in schools. So they'll come and get information from parents, and then they'll take it, they'll get information from students and everything, but not bringing everybody together and say, okay, now what are we all gonna work for, right? Like, let's find 2 or 3 things that we all wanna see together. And there's still 10 things that we need to do, but what are the 2 or 3 things that we can work together? And I think that's when we have that synergy across the stakeholder, that's going to be the piece. But until we can decide, meaning as an institution, each individual institution, that we want to take the chance and the risk to bring these stakeholders together to ask those questions and actually take the time, right? Not do it at 9 o'clock in the morning when all the parents and students are in school or at work, but at work, but really do that and take that deliberate time. I think those are the pieces where we're going to see magic, and we can see across the state, excuse me, not across the state, across the nation, where things that have happened like that, those have been where they have been transforming communities when they've actually come and brought people in together and all stakeholders, young and old, in and outside of the institution.
Alejandra, just to add on to what Dina was talking about, there's a lot of amazing work, and your organization and that equity group is doing a lot of that amazing work and trying to find ways to replicate that, to spread it to other places is the big challenge. I talked about in the beginning how we now have all the districts in San Bernardino, Riverside County are participating in this National Student Clearinghouse. Well, that work started out of RCOE, right? And then there was some efforts to push that forward, but it was folks talking about the value of it and how it works and how that could be shared, and then bringing together leaders to say, well, let's try this thing. Let's find ways to try and push this forward. And we have to be both, teachers and learners in this space and thinking about those efforts. As for the policymakers, our early childhood colleagues in the region have formed something called the Children's Cabinet. And Gary probably knows more about who's running all the pieces. I'm a little confused by it. I just attend the meetings and help out. But one of the things that they did was that we did, I guess, is that we identified specific language that we started bringing to Board of Supervisors meetings, governing boards, district governing boards, and started a way of just refining the same message. And what that did was that those our civic leaders began saying that message back to us. They were learning about this, and that helped with engagement for them, because then they begin to see and understand what's going on. It was a really interesting model. I'm sure Gary can connect you with the right folks who were the strategy behind that. I was just one of the peons in the work, but I thought that was a really powerful strategy. And I'm thinking, how else can we do that? I know Dina does this too, because she's a school board member.
Yeah. Thanks, Carlos. And yeah, it's part of that is about having, because these people are so busy and they're packed with their day. It's like having something for them to react to, some kind of material data that's super easy. They don't have to think about it. You say, okay, here it is. Here's a one pager. This is it. And then it kind of sticks in. Because if you give them a 30-page report like we're putting out right now, they're gonna maybe we'll skip to the end and read synopsis or something. But yeah, something very succinct for them to react to, and like you said, then they could start repeating it back too. So anyone else that's tap on that?
I would just add, especially educating legislators on policies that are regarding higher education is very difficult. Sometimes their focus is not necessarily on higher education, but becoming allies with their staffers is definitely crucial. In that way, they're able to motivate that legislator to be able to advocate for whatever priority you're pushing for.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Excellent. So we are right at time, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today, talk about this really important topic. I know there's definitely more research and more work that needs to be done. So we're hoping that by flagging some of these materials, this is a good kind of first step in, we can build from here. Of course, feel free to reach out to us with any questions. I'll go ahead and drop my email in the chat in case anyone else has any follow-up questions. But I wish you all a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you, panelists. It has been an honor. So take care, everyone.